Two and a Half Admins, episode 36. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. And shock horror, you've got a blog post to promote, Alan.
Yes. So this week we got a rundown of the FreeBSD IOStat tool, which can tell you about what's happening on your system in a bunch of different ways, including how much is going through the teletype, but more usefully, how much is going on in the CPU and monitoring all of your disks, including separating them by type.
Fair enough. And you also want to plug EuroBSDCon 2021 call for papers.
Yes. Only have a couple more weeks left to submit your talk proposal. The conference is going to be remote this year, so it means it's that much easier for other people to present, even if you can't make it to Vienna this time.
Right, well, links to both those in the show notes then. Let's do some news then. And the first one is something that you tried out and wrote about, Jim. Graphical Linux apps on the Windows subsystem for Linux, WSLG.
Yes, we have GUI apps in WSL now, and the whole experience was pretty great, honestly. Every time I've installed WSL, to write about it for ours, it's always been a pain in the ass. There's some extra step you have to do this time that you didn't last time, or that, whatever tutorial you're following didn't quite get you to. And either you don't have everything you need, or you got WSL 1, you wanted WSL 2, there's just all kinds of pitfalls and crap. But this time around, the only real difficult part is that you got to be on a Windows Insider dev channel build. You can't install it on a normal Windows 10 machine. But once you've done that, once you've verified that you're on Windows 10 Insider dev channel, all you got to do is drop to a terminal and say WSL -- install, and that's it. Installs everything, including the graphic and audio support. And for the most part, everything just works. I ran Firefox under WSLG, so the Ubuntu Firefox in a window on a Windows 10 desktop. That was kind of surreal. But video and audio both worked fine. More importantly, this is like a big get for me. I ran Virt Manager on it, which, there's no Windows port for Virt Manager, which has been a pain in my butt because you got to install something like MOBA Xterm to get a Windows X11 server, and then do like an SSH-X to some other machine to run Virt Manager on, and it mostly works, but some of the elements are always wonky when you do that. Like drop-down menus never look right. It's enough to really be annoying anyway, and none of that was the case under WSLG, even though it's still very much in beta and only available on the dev channel of Insider builds. I wouldn't have been upset with it at all as a day-to-day tool.
Yeah, it sounds quite interesting. So is it actually running some kind of X server, or?
Yeah, it's actually running X Wayland.
That was going to be my other question. Was it actually Wayland in the back end?
Yeah, it's a Western compositor, right?
Yeah, that was actually, I listened to you guys' coverage of that on Late Night Linux, Joe. And I don't know if the conspiracy theory is exactly the phrase I want to use, but it occurs to me as kind of interesting that right in the same month, Ubuntu finally releases an Ubuntu desktop based on Wayland, and Microsoft, who has been buddy-buddy with Canonical for several years now, pushes out their first graphical, Linux-style display server for Windows, and it's, Wayland, not Xorg.
I don't think there's any conspiracy there. I think it's just that Wayland is finally in a position where it's ready.
So Wayland arguably has been ready for a while, but, Canonical just hasn't felt the need to do anything with it. It's wild speculation on my part. It's not like I'm mad at anybody if it did happen that way, but I can't help but wonder if, Microsoft engineers were like, we're going to do this WSLG thing, but if we got to do all this crap, let's do it on Wayland, please. And they're already working with the Canonical folks, so.
For sure, if you're building something new, you would be like, well, let's target where things are going, not where they are now or where they are trying to leave from.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, it would be terrible. So how well did the apps integrate into the field of Windows?
No, they were skinned as though they were on a Linux machine.
Right.
The window decorations were a little largish and old school looking.
Maybe the DPI scaling isn't quite right, or just that the theme is just old.
No, the theme just looks super old. It's I don't know, Windows XP sized window decorations. Okay. They're not colored. It's all monochrome. It's very simplistic, but they're noticeably big and kind of crude looking.
But it does integrate pretty well into the system, right? In terms of the panel and the menu and everything.
You still get a panel for it on the launcher in the Windows desktop. Window decorations themselves are a bit hit and miss. Firefox had a full set, but everything else pretty much just had, an X and that was it. But the window up and window down keyboard shortcuts to minimize and maximize work on Windows. But the window button left and right shortcuts to maximize half left and half right, those did not work.
But it's still just a developer build, right? So.
Yeah, it's still just a dev build.
If I was a Linux conspiracy theorist, I'd be like, yes, well, what Microsoft managed to do here is give you just enough Linux to never need to install Linux.
And this is always a topic that comes up. Is this good for Linux? Is this bad? Oh my God, this is going to kill the dream of Linux on the desktop, but I don't see it.
No.
And I think there's a big plus for us, all in on the Linux or BSD ecosystem folks here too, because when people start asking, what's the killer Linux app? They usually have trouble coming up with one. For mine, it's Virt Manager because there's no Windows port of it, and I use it every day, and it's crucial. But the thing is, there have been lots of killer Linux apps. They've long since gotten ported to Windows as well because, you got to do that to get the market share. But once WSL-G is, in everybody's hands and it's, complete, it's already stable, but, a few more minor bugs maybe get worked out. I don't know. The question then becomes if you're a Linux developer and you make the next Audacity or Blender or GIMP or Krita or whatever, do you even care about doing a native Windows port anymore? Because it's easy to just run your app under Windows and have it run quite well indeed.
Yeah, I can definitely see the case for that, where it means more and more apps will not bother with a native Windows port. And, the other direction as well is now you got a whole bunch of Windows people who will start getting introduced to the real power of a proper shell and everything, and might inspire more of them to be like, well, it turns out I use almost all the Linux stuff on my Windows machine. Why don't I just switch to Linux?
Which is a lot of how I switched to Linux on the desktop. I had been finding ways to do things on Windows, Cygwin or, whatever, yada, yada, yada for a while.
Oh, yeah. I've had the GNU Win32 package installed on every one of my Windows computers for almost 20 years now, so that I could just have grep and sort and so on in the Windows command line for the odd time I needed them for something.
Yeah.
We do like to take the piss out of you, Alan, for running Windows, but you do run Windows right now on that machine you're talking to us. Does this interest you, being able to run Linux stuff?
Yeah. Being able to have a real shell is kind of helpful, although my need for it isn't that great because there's not much stored on this computer. Almost all of its storage comes off my FreeBSD NAS in the basement, and so if I need to do something to my files via the shell, I just do it over SSH and so on. And I kind of in the same situation as Jim. Is if outside of the bit of media stuff, and now that OBS works so well, short of a little bit of video gaming and so on, every app I use works perfectly fine on Linux and BSD now, right? Like the chat clients I use, like Quazzle and my Firefox and Thunderbird and my text editors, and there's not much keeping me on Windows much anymore, except for video games and media production.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by Linode. Go to linode.com/2.5 to get started with $100 free credit and 60 days to use it. Linode offers cloud computing solutions in data centers all over the world. Whether it's scalable VMs with a choice of major distros or one-click apps and stacks, dedicated CPU and high RAM instances, block and object storage, or cloud firewalls and DDoS protection, Linode has everything you need for your personal projects right up to managed enterprise infrastructure. I recently moved my website over to Linode and it was really straightforward. And when I needed a Mumble server for our Late Night Linux community meetups, spinning up a new VM for that was an absolute breeze. Everything's been running flawlessly since I set it up, and I love the peace of mind I get from the automatic backups. So go to linode.com/2.5, get your $100 credit, and check out Linode's great cloud hosting services and first-class, always available support. That's linode.com/2.5. So another big story in Linux land over the last couple of weeks is the University of Minnesota and them doing an experiment on the Linux kernel.
I believe the phrase you used was right shower of bastards, and I couldn't agree more.
Well, in particular, this was them conducting an experiment not on the kernel, but on the kernel developers, the people.
Yeah, if you've been living under a Linux rock for the last couple of weeks and don't know what we're talking about, 3 researchers from the University of Minnesota decided that they wanted to, it kind of amounts to a penetration test, really, of the Linux kernel development process. And what they said they did is found 3 minor bugs in Linux and 3 other bugs that were what they called, I believe, immature vulnerabilities. I would probably say latent. Basically, it's a bug that can't be exploited yet, just because some condition hasn't been met. And what they would do is they would take these 3 minor bug fixes that they'd made, and they would introduce the missing condition for an existing bug to get exploited. And they called this hypocrite commits. Your guess as to exactly why they thought that was a great name is as good as mine. But so they would take these patches and they would ask a first-line developer on the LKML, hey, can you take this over? Does this look good? And, if that first-line developer who, usually when somebody asks for help like this, what they're really saying is, can you, help me make sure I get my ducks in a row so that a senior dev isn't going to get mad at the style that I wrote this in, or, whether I get tabs instead of spaces, or, whatever. Not like, hey, I need you to tell me, like, you and only you need to certify this code bug free. Like, that's not really how that works, right? But at that point, they would kind of declare that a win, and they would tell the developer who'd said, okay, thanks, looks good, or whatever. They would say, nope, don't use that. That's a bad patch, and this is why, and this is what'll happen if you do that. But here's a good patch that doesn't do that, because I'm a good Linux citizen. They did this for a total of 3 supposed bugs, and there's some dissent as to whether they even actually found and fixed any real bugs. Greg KH has been very unimpressed on the LKML, let's say.
Banned their entire domain and reverted all 190 something commits. Well, tried to revert them all, found some that had problems, and so quickly reverted all the ones he could easily revert, and then was going to review the rest.
The kernel development team has put the entire University of Minnesota on a default deny policy at this point.
Which is sort of fair enough, isn't it?
Yeah, it really pretty much is. The thing is, there were ways that these folks could have gone about their project ethically, and they just didn't. Like I said, it was what amounts to a pen test. And there are established ways that, you negotiate a pen test. First you actually get the consent of the facility that you want to test. And, then you get a contract, you have a scope of what you can and can't do.
Yeah, and usually that's a deal with management, right? And they don't necessarily tell all their subordinates that it's going to happen.
Exactly. So that's the next objection everybody always has, is that, you can't do that without tainting the results. And it's like, look, Linus frickin' Torvalds is not the one who's answering every newbie's first email, with a random patch they've got. You can get a sign-off from Linus without, tainting the entire experiment. So, of course, the next objection is, well, Linus is just going to tell me to pound sand. And that's almost certainly true. But A, there was a chance. And B, the whole point of asking for permission is the implied right of the person you're asking to say no. Like, this is what makes it ethical.
Yeah, although for research on humans, usually you need the informed consent of the person being researched on, not just the person they work for. This is a weird gray area in that, you're doing research on people, although really you're checking the procedure that the Linux kernel mailing list uses to review incoming patches and so on. It's definitely sticky, but they definitely didn't do the right thing. I don't know that anything they could have done would have got them where they wanted to go, but maybe that was for the best in the end.
This is an aspect that I haven't seen anybody really talking about much, but they kind of doubled down and got salty with Greg KH on the mailing list.
Yeah, they started saying, oh, this is you treating noobs badly and stuff like that.
Yeah, saying Greg KH was slandering them, and he was just being so mean, and they didn't know the kernel that well. And it's like, well, if you don't know the kernel that well, then why are you trying to advise us on the kernel? Why are you building, this tool that supposedly will automatically detect and repair issues in the kernel that produces garbage? And you don't say, hey, can you check the results of my tool for me? You say, hey, here's patches, apply these. This whole thing kind of came in 2 waves. There was the hypocrite commits that the UMN researchers admitted to being bogus, but that was only 3 patches. There were another much larger batch of patches submitted by, I'm probably going to butcher his name, but Aditya Paki. He had already submitted tons of them, which had already come to Greg KH's attention, not because somebody said, oh, I gave you a bad patch, but because it was freaking garbage. And, he's pointing out that you're writing patches for bugs that don't exist and introducing bugs with your nonsense patch that anybody who can read can see is nonsense. Why are you wasting our time?
Yeah, I think a little bit in the very beginning of this, when people just saw the abstract of the paper, there was some people assumed it meant that these researchers had managed to, introduce 100 bugs into the Linux kernel. And that's resulted in the kind of knee-jerk reaction of just revert everything that this university has ever submitted, including some stuff from years ago before this research that had nothing to do with it and so on.
Yeah, but the university's had ethical problems for a long time. In 2014, the University of Minnesota got in trouble because one of its research groups just basically shit up all the reviews on an Amazon Mechanical Turk review website. Third party, not run by Amazon, just some person had set up a website, to review Mechanical Turk opportunities and or workers, I'm not sure. Mm-hmm. And these University of Minnesota folks just decided, hey, we'll just, crap this all up with tons of bad reviews and see what the impact of that on people is.
Ouch.
What happened to Minnesota Nice, eh?
Yeah, Minnesota Nice apparently is for the underclass only.
So we can't ignore the FreeBSD WireGuard connection here. It's not the same thing, but there are some parallels at least.
Basically, no amount of code review can catch everything.
At the same time, maybe no amount of code review can catch anything, but these folks' patches did not make it past the senior kernel reviewers on the Linux side.
Well, part of the time was because as soon as it went past the first level, they're like, actually, no, here's the real patch.
No, they were already on Greg K.H.'s shit list from the first, 100 and some odd that they never said, these are bogus. He had already complained to their university about them 2 or 3 times before the latest Hypocrite commit thing, which kind of, it brings us back to the whole, no, man, it's a lot harder to slip one by in the Linux kernel community. Greg K.H. was already aggro with these folks at their university level before they started saying, hey, we gave you bad patches.
Right, okay. There seems to be a lot of confusion around how many bad patches they actually sent. Was it 100 or was it 3? Or 5, I guess, in that other paper?
I think it was roughly 100 that were, just the garbage supposedly produced by this tool that Aditya Paki wrote. But I'm not really qualified to say personally. Greg K.H. seemed to think there was no such tool, that was just more, smoke and lies.
Right. So the tool generated patches that just weren't very useful. And then separately, they had the Hypocrite commits, which were purposely bad patches,
right,
that they would then swap out with a good patch.
Although at this point, this is assuming that the first batch really were generated by some tool and everything is exactly as described.
Right.
Which I don't know that we can really just assume that
right
at this point.
Yeah, having dealt with tools like Coverity, which usually find legitimate issues, although many times ones that aren't necessarily worth the effort to fix. It's like, oh, you didn't free this bit of memory right before you exit the program, and so it will get freed anyway.
Right.
You can get a lot of niggling warnings like that, and it can be a burden to have people submit a bunch of diffs just to deal with these things that aren't important at all, and can drown out real work that's trying to get done and reviewed.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by CBT Nuggets, training for IT professionals or anyone looking to build IT skills. Go to cbtnuggets.com/25admins and sign up for a 7-day free trial. I've just started my learning journey with CBT Nuggets, but I've already picked up tons of knowledge from the short and manageable videos in the Docker and Network Fundamentals courses. Their in-house trainers are active and certified IT professionals who add around 40 hours of new training to the course catalog each week, so you can always stay current and up to date. So start your free 7-day trial today at cbtnuggets.com/25admins. It includes unlimited access to all course materials, including virtual labs. That's cbtnuggets.com/25admins. Let's do some free consulting then. You can send your questions in to show@2.5admins.com. And thank you everyone who supports us on Patreon and PayPal. That's really appreciated. If you want to learn more about that, 2.5admins.com/support. And remember, for $5 or more per month, you can get an advert-free RSS feed on Patreon. So the first question is from a patron. Thor says, I want to set up a Nextcloud server, among other things, on a VPS, and I intend to use Docker Compose and ZFS. But I want to make sure that I can back up the data to my NAS at home. I also want to be able to recreate the VPS in a relatively short time, in case the hosting provider burns down. Yeah, that bit me. Ouch. What would be the best way to organize the data and configuration to allow me to get a new VPS up and running from my backup quick and easy? I'm considering Docker volumes, and I'm testing a Docker setup on my NAS using Docker ZFS storage driver, mounting var lib docker, and adding ZFS driver to the config. But this creates loads of subvolumes and datasets. The sub-datasets have names that make it hard to distinguish a volume with video data that I don't need to back up, and the ones with my pictures and documents that do need backing up. Would you discuss structuring and also how I would implement a backup software like Linode or others? Would it also make sense to have that set up in Docker Compose to make sure that any deployment would also get the backup software running? Is an Ansible role better for that?
I'm not that familiar with the Docker bits of this, but in general, what I would do here is create two datasets called like backup and no backup under wherever you're going to put this in your ZFS hierarchy so that it ends up in your Docker container or whatever. And then create your sub datasets under that and just manipulate the mount points to integrate them into the normal place in your file system where you'd want them to be. And then you can easily snapshot all the stuff under the backup dataset and replicate it using Linode or whatever, and not do that for the ones under no backup.
I think it may be a little bit more difficult than that. And the problem is that most of this really comes in the Docker side, not the ZFS side. And I'm not any more familiar with Docker than Alan is. I've seen it like a couple of times with ZFS. And from what I recall, by default, Docker just kind of creates data sets where it wants to do so. And it's kind of a giant hodgepodge of like all the stuff, underneath one place. There's not really a good way to separate out what you do versus what you don't want to back up. Where Docker keeps those is almost certainly configurable if you can find it, but I can't really tell you, where to go to get there. But beyond that, yeah, if you can, what Alan said is exactly correct. Pretty much always, when you've got stuff that you do want to back up and stuff that you don't, then you want to have them under separate parent data sets so that you can just replicate the parent data set of all the stuff you want to back up and get it all backed up.
In that case, it's probably easiest to just make the data sets that actually contain the pictures and the videos outside of Docker and just mount them inside, in the subdirectory in the container where they'll be visible or whatever.
Nope.
Doesn't work that way?
The Docker ZFS stuff has like lots of integrations with, rolling back the container, rolling back the data set, and like it's tied into ZFS. It has its own ideas of what it wants to do.
Right. But that's all for the Docker container. And I'm saying, can you just mount, say, the video data set as an extra data set over top of an empty directory somewhere in the Docker container and have it not managed by Docker while the rest of the Dockery stuff is, so that you can back up and restore the whole Docker container or do all the Dockery stuff with ZFS, but just have the, your video and pictures data sets be separate and not managed by Docker and then just mounted into the container. That's basically how you normally do stuff with jails on FreeBSD, is that, the jail contains the extra copy of the operating system or whatever you're going to run in the jail. And then you just mount some data into a data directory somewhere from the host.
That's probably be problematic as well because, the containers are containers. They have access to very specific parts of the file system.
Right.
And if you just jump in another directory that's, mounted beneath, the container knows the difference. And if the other is outside its path, it's not going to be happy about it. And you can also alter, what that container's, allowed paths ought to be, but just no, I don't think any of this ends up being simple.
It sounds to me that maybe containers, for all the benefits that they bring, are maybe not the way to go about doing this particular job.
Probably not. Like if you can just have where Nextcloud keeps its configuration be a data set, like where it's metadata database and all that, and then you have the data sets for videos and the data set for pictures or whatever, and you replicate the first two, the Nextcloud data set and the pictures data set, but not the video data set, then all you have to do when you reset up your VPS is install Nextcloud and then replicate back with the backup tool the Nextcloud configuration and database and the files that you want to be on the VPS, and you're done. That's pretty much how, like at my video streaming company, how the servers are built. Each server has a /CFG directory that contains about 10 files of local configuration, and the rest of the operating system is a ZFS dataset, and when it's time to upgrade the operating system, we just overwrite it with a newer one. And we do that all the time. And then they have another separate data set where they keep caches and local data that can go away, but the more is cached, the more money we save, and so on. And talking about the idea of having the two different parent data sets, another way I've used a system like that before is to separate out chunks of a file system. So in FreeBSD, most of your binaries under, USR/bin, but then you have USR local where you have all your local stuff. And so I made two different hierarchies so that all the stuff under user bin, user sbin, and a bunch of other system directories were read-only. But the stuff where user home and user local where you install packages were not read-only. So you could have an immutable base system, but you could do whatever you wanted. And this way, no one could install a setuid binary in the wrong place because they could only install it in user local, which had the ZFS flag that doesn't allow setuid binaries and things like that. It works very well for being able to do backup this and not that, is, like Jim said, just two different parent data sets so you can have different policies. And that's why you have this tree of data sets in ZFS with the inheritances, so that you can define a policy at this level and so everything under it will inherit that policy, but the sibling can have a different policy and all of its children will inherit that.
Okay, Laubo, I think that's how you say it, says, I have a Windows 10 machine that I would like to turn into a VM using Beehive on FreeBSD. KVM on Proxmox is also of interest for a friend of mine who's a Debian Linux fan. I'd appreciate your advice on how to configure the storage for the VM and any recommendation for backup of the VM. Any advice how to turn the Windows host into a VM aside from installing it from scratch is also welcome.
Are there still a lot of tools around the whole physical to virtual stuff?
It's the same old ones. They generally work.
Yeah, so for that, I would say use the physical to virtual tool, which would normally make you like a VMDK for VMware. And then you can use either the QEMU or VirtualBox tools to convert it to a RAW, which you can then use on FreeBSD or KVM.
Those tools are kind of a pain in the butt. They're not that great, especially not the free versions. At this point in time, you're probably better off just using the Windows 10 backup, like the literal Windows backup tool. Save that to a location on the network, and then you can use Windows Restore once you've done a clean Windows 10 install in your VM. Get all of your setup back that way. I've found that to be more reliable than the what is the name of it? It's a VMware tool.
Yeah, and it's just general P2V stuff, because the main thing is that Windows only installs the drivers for the hardware it sees, and getting it to have the right drivers to run in the virtualization is always more complicated. Especially like Windows in FreeBSD, you need the Red Hat, or basically I think on KVM too, you want the Red Hat VirtIO drivers, which aren't going to be there by default, although you can either install them, slipstream them into the install if you're doing a new install, or install them on the Windows 10 before you P2V it. But I'd second Jim's idea that you can do it that way, but you're probably going to have a lot less hassle just doing a regular Windows install and then restoring a backup of whatever it was, or just rebuilding it. I don't know what's on your Windows 10 box that you're wanting to get into the VM, because if it's just a couple of apps, it might be faster to just do it all from scratch. But the Windows backup tool has gotten quite a bit better of saving your state and making it so that, reinstalling your OS is not as traumatic as it used to be.
Yeah. And the other problem with using was it VMware Converter, I think?
Yeah, that sounds right.
I've encountered a few boxes that the resulting image was unusable as it was, because it would have like a motherboard driver installed on it. Mm-hmm. And ASUS is particularly bad about this. A lot of their driver patch sets, if those are present on a machine that is not, based on that ASUS motherboard, it will just blue screen immediately. And that was happening inside the VM images, and trying to figure out how to, remove that from that image was a giant pain in the butt. And if you do it the Windows backup route, then you don't have that problem at all. Yeah,
it's always been the problem with Windows, is unlike, a Unix like Linux or FreeBSD, where all the drivers are there and it just loads the ones based on the hardware it finds, and it can be different hardware every reboot and it doesn't care. Windows very much builds up a lot of state about what drivers are installed and how they're used and what plugged into what and so on. And it gets very upset if, suddenly, even it can be as simple as if you go in your BIOS and change your storage controller to do AHCI versus RAID versus emulating IDE, and Windows will just blue screen at boot and be like, I can't find the hard drives because I didn't bother installing the drivers for the other options.
So as for the other part of the question, I think even I can answer this one. I can guess what you two are going to say.
Oh, goody.
Where you're going to store your VMs and do your backups, well, just ZFS solves that problem, as we've talked about many, many times.
Right. If you're using Beehive on FreeBSD or KVM on Proxmox, both cases, you end up with the VM files living on ZFS. And so it's easy to snapshot them and replicate them using a tool like Sanoid or whatever to get them somewhere else in a way that you can spin up that VM on the other box when the time comes. If you're doing it on vanilla FreeBSD, I would recommend using zvols as opposed to just putting files in a data set, because I did the work to hook bhyve up to do trim correctly. So it will actually, when you free space inside the guest, and the guest does a trim on the virtual SSD that is the virtual hard drive, that will result in ZFS actually freeing the space on the host. Doing that for files doesn't quite work yet, but will eventually.
Right, well, we better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send any questions for Jim and Alan. You can find me on Twitter @Joe Rissington.
I'm at JRSSNet.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.